Welcome to episode 3 of Open Books with Alana and Erin, two female leaders modernizing the accounting space. Today we are talking about one of my most favorite topics, imposter syndrome.
Dun, dun, dun.
We're going to talk about a lot of things. Is it generational? How do we recognize it in ourselves? How do we resolve it in ourselves? How do we recognize it in our team and help them kind of get over it? We'll talk again about what we've learned from our team and what we wish we would tell ourselves.
Yeah.
But first of all, when was the last time you experienced imposter syndrome?
Am I allowed to say right now?
Yes.
Like, who am I to, host a podcast? But seriously, probably like right now when we're doing this whole podcast thing, it's like brought up some of that for me for sure.
A little bit of insecurity.
A little, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
What about you? When's the last time?
Same.
Yeah.
It really... So there's always like a little bit of imposter syndrome kind of floating around.
Yep.
It really hit last weekend when we were having some technical issues with the podcast, and immediately I started going down the I know nothing.
Oh.
Why am I even trying to do this technical stuff? Like this isn't. I didn't go to school for this. I can't learn it. I'm too old. Just like everything.
Yeah. Yep.
So yeah, it definitely now.
Yeah, currently.
Almost constant.
It's just different levels, but it bubbles there.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
No. We want to get past it, right?
Exactly.
And that's what we're here to talk about today.
Definitely.
As much as we joke, it is tough.
Very
right?
tough. Yeah.
To get over it, like with ourselves, with our team, like it's a tough thing, I think.
It is. Yeah.
Totally.
Very tough.
So as we were thinking about this episode, you had done some research, right? Because you brought up a really interesting question, which I had never considered, but I love that you did. Just looking into like, is imposter syndrome generational? Which is so interesting to me. So what did you find out?
I love the way that you said did research. I Googled.
AKA research.
Yeah, research. So I will say that I looked at some things that I would consider reputable.
Yeah.
Like the American Psychology Association. I will list the sources of where I went. Looked there, also looked at Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Fast Brands, if you know anything about them. They own a lot of franchise things. Wouldn't necessarily trust their reporting. But I wanted to get a really broad view. And usually they say from all the articles, it's generational, but there's not a lot of consensus about which generations experience.
Okay.
For sure, millennials.
Yeah.
That was the one section that was included in all the articles.
Yeah. So we have consensus there.
That's the one bit of consensus. The one article said Gen X and millennials. One was millennials and Gen Z.
Okay.
The Fast Brands article was asking the question if Gen Z is going to be the first generation to not experience imposter syndrome.
Oh, really?
Which was very interesting in like dichotomy with the other ones that were like, no, it definitely affects Gen Z as well.
Yeah.
So I found that pretty interesting. But so millennials, you got it. Like, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But then it also called out some other like subsections of individuals. Women by far experience it more frequently than men, and even more so are women of color and those in the LGBTQ plus space. So marginalized communities definitely feel it. Not that everyone in those communities does, but it's a very high percentage.
Yep.
So yeah, it was a pretty interesting Googling experience of reading these articles and seeing who felt what, but does seem to be a little bit generational,
Yep.
but mostly oppressed or marginalized communities experience it at much higher percentages than your generic white man.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's so, it's interesting. And like, we're not going to solve imposter syndrome today.
Right.
Like, really wish we could, and but I think it's so important, like, to understand what people in our teams like might
Yes.
be experiencing more, than others, or just like that general makeup. I think it's really important as leaders that we're mindful of that.
Yes.
Right. And like, it all just starts with educating yourself, right? So
Yeah.
that's really great.
It was an eye-opening read for sure.
Yeah.
But not not surprising.
Right.
Right. Just from what we've talked about and talking to other people, a lot of people our age have this feeling. It's talked about more now.
Yeah.
Than it was even 5 years ago.
Yep.
Which is great to see, but still not talked about a lot.
Yeah, it's like not commonly like accepted maybe, or so, as like general conversation.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I think, like growing in like transparency maybe of imposter syndrome.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So, imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
We're both millennials.
Yep.
We both experience it. How do you recognize it in yourself?
Yeah, and I like the way you phrase that question, because I think like to be able to start to process through, like we have to recognize it first, right? And so for me, when I start feeling like that imposter syndrome starting to like creep in, I say creep in, but it comes in like a freight train, really quick. And I like have a little cartoon that goes in my head, and my brain becomes like this filing cabinet room, right, with just like a ton of files, and I am just like panicking through, like throwing open drawers 2 at a time, 4 at a time, like searching for the answer. And when it's really bad, like I'm never finding that answer, right? So it's just like this panic, frantic, like desperate almost feeling. So, I can start to feel like that anxiety starting to creep up, those physical responses that a lot of people get. So I have to work myself back down. And to do that, I repeat to myself, like, I trust myself to figure this out, like putting it back on myself. Like I trust myself to figure it out. Trying to calm my heart rate a little bit, right? As much as I can. And then, I have to ask the person who I'm talking to, like, to repeat the question, because I've just gone through a whole emotional cycle in the last like 30 seconds. So we'll just start the conversation again. How do you recognize it in yourself?
So I've been thinking about this since we decided to do this topic. And at first it was kind of a panicky, anxiety, stress thing. But as I've been thinking back to the times where I really was experiencing it like on a very deep level, it's a fist tightening in my gut, like, oh my gosh, everything goes cold and then hot. So there's that physiological response. That's when it's really bad, when I am absolutely at the, like, I should never have become a leader. I am the worst person in the world. Like, I have screwed up my whole team because of this. Which has happened. It's not great. But in the day-to-day, it is I panic is a good word to describe it, because it is a very like flighty emotion, if that makes sense. So the two levels, I would say, of my imposter syndrome is definitely the physical gut clench, and then the despair is probably the best way to describe it. I failed everyone. Why am I like, oh, it's horrible. But then there's just like the day-to-day of, like someone said a phrase or a sentence and I immediately am just like, well, what am I what am I doing here? An example, if you don't mind me sharing, is when we were doing like tests, mic tests and stuff for the podcast, we got some input from our friends.
Yep.
And one of them was saying how good your voice was for podcasting. And that wasn't even talking about me.
Yeah.
But because I'm already insecure
Yep.
about this in general, it immediately sent me down that means I don't have a good voice.
Right.
That means I don't belong.
Yep.
Why am I doing this? I don't feel like just that one phrase. And me being the person who doesn't have boundaries, as we discussed in our last episode, asked the person, like, what am I, chopped liver? And of course that made them feel awkward.
Yeah.
And it was,
Yep.
but that was my initial like response of, oh, okay, I guess I don't belong.
Yeah.
And then I got defensive about it, and that's what came out. And
Yep.
you know, afterwards I'm like, sorry you guys, that was just a little bit of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Like,
Don't mind me.
Yeah. Let's start this conversation over.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's that's how I recognize it.
Totally. What's so interesting though, and I think it just like explains like imposter syndrome to a T, is so you're feeling, you know, that way after that conversation about the podcast. I feel that way. For those who don't know, you very much have like set up all our tech stuff for the podcast. Like you have, you know, you've carried a big burden with that. And many times I am just standing on the outskirts holding cords for Erin. Or, you know, like holding my microphone, just waiting for her to tell me to like, okay, plug it in here type of thing. And so and nobody has said anything.
Yeah.
Right, but
this is the first I am hearing
I
about
know.
this.
But it very much brings imposter syndrome for me because I'm like,
Oh.
who am I? Like, I have a microphone. Can I join a podcast? Is what I feel like. But because I am like lost in this world, except for like what I have to say. And so that has made me feel like an imposter with this experience. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
We both have kind of like at a general level, we feel it with this, but then kind of like at that practical, like daily piece of the podcast, we're feeling that in different ways.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
Yeah. I know. So
that's great.
I know. So we've talked about like recognizing it with ourselves. How do you help your team work through and like think through themselves with imposter syndrome?
So I have a very a visual, I guess you could say, of how I try to help my team. And it's great doing a visual on an audio medium of a podcast. So I'll try to explain it as I'm moving my hands around. So let's say you have like a 10-story building, right? We start at the bottom with like our confidence level. And when something happens to make us question everything, we're digging a hole deeper. I try to use confidence boosters with my team so that rather than being on ground floor and being really affected by the whatever is said or whatever happens, I want to bump them up. So they're like 5 stories high.
Okay.
So when they hit or when they have a situation where they question themselves, they're already up higher than they normally would be. So that's hopefully not going to affect them as much.
Okay.
And by confidence boosters, I mean like letting them know when I think they've done a really good job communicating with a client, or that right now we're working on month-end closes. So it's calling out specific things in their month-end close that they've done very well, or something I knew they were working on and trying to get better at. I want to make sure I'm capturing that as I see it and letting them know right then. I don't want to hold it until our quarterly eval or whatever we're doing. I want to make sure I am telling them as I see it. And I try to do that at least once a week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Where I'm recognizing something that they've been working on, whether it's time management or a specific portion of their clothes. Like it could be soft skills or technical work, but I want to make sure that I'm really boosting them up so they know that they deserve to be where they are for being themselves and working hard and just being part of the team.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I'm trying to break that imposter syndrome mold, boost them up a little bit. So when they do get hit with it, because I think it's inevitable, that it doesn't take them quite down into the depths of hell like it does some other people.
I think that's a really great analogy. And also, I think what I'm hearing that you're doing is like in those moments where maybe, you know, an onset is coming, they have like actual like good things to pull from, like facts and evidence of like why, you know, why they're a good employee and a good person, and they can actually like repurpose those you know, that praise to like help them in the moment even probably.
And hopefully they're hearing that often enough. Like it's happening for different things often enough that they can pull that as they run into a mistake they made or have an irate client or something. That's kind of my goal. How about you? What are you doing with your team?
Yeah, I think it's like inevitable, right? Like team members are going to feel that way. I try with my team to kind of like process through it, I guess, when it comes up. I love like your analogy of like preparing them for it for sure. Which I try to do. I think in the moment when I try to help identify when it's coming on, which I think is also like, you know, interesting to try to help identify employees in the moment. But then like work through it with them. And what's interesting, I think, is you can't have an imposter syndrome mindset and a growth mindset at the same time, right? And for our podcast viewers, they're probably like, well, duh, you can only have, you know, like one thing at a time. But I say that to mean like if somebody has the onset of imposter syndrome, they can't be thinking about the future. That's like a definition of imposter syndrome. Like you're so focused on literally everything failing right now. There is no future to be had, right? And so I think helping my team like walk through, okay, we have to get through this together. We're going to solve it and get through this because you want to achieve or you want to be here in 6 months, a year, 5 years, but we have to get through this now, right? So like helping them see what's ahead, and this is just a stepping stone to get there. It doesn't define your career as much as it feels like it will. It doesn't. And even in those moments, like sharing with them, like, I felt this exact way too. And you just got to keep going through it. But like, as much as people don't talk about it, many of us go through what you're feeling right now. And I promise, like, there's a tomorrow, there's 6 months from now, you know, we'll get through it type of thing.
Yeah. It's when we were talking before and putting together our notes that you can't have a growth mindset with imposter syndrome wasn't ever something I had thought about. It like as blatantly stated as that is. But it is so true because you're so focused on how things are going wrong right now that any thought of anything in the future is just not happening. Because you feel like you're failing in the moment. So you have no future. So yeah, when you had written that out, it was such a light bulb moment for me to be like, that's exactly the verbiage that is so valid and so true, but I had never really put the pieces together. That you can't have that growth mindset with imposter syndrome.
Because there's quite literally like no future, you know, in what you're thinking, or like you're feeling like, okay, like I'm not a good accountant. So like, how can you even fathom now leading a team of accountants when you're doubting like your ability? So I think just helping the team like process through that. And like, there's so many, you know, things ahead. Like we're going to get to this goal and we just got to get you through today, you know, one day at a time type of thing.
One other thing you brought up is kind of sharing that I've been here before.
Yeah.
I've experienced that. And we had been talking, and I had asked you if any of your team had
Yep.
actually come up and used the term imposter syndrome in a meeting with you.
Yeah.
And I don't think any had.
No, they'll generally like, share the feelings and so when I say like you first have to help team members identify,
Yeah.
it's I think because I've not had a team member be like, I'm experiencing imposter syndrome now type
Yeah.
of thing. So you almost have to kind of like read through the lines.
Mhm.
But when we had that conversation, you said you had.
I did. Yeah. One recently, she used the term imposter syndrome. And it got me thinking of who else I had heard used the term.
Yeah.
Because she was the first team member that I lead that used it. And in thinking about who I've talked to about it, only the people at the approximate same like management or leadership role
Yeah.
has actually used the term. So then I'm thinking, okay, is this just like a accounting industry thing or a management / leadership thing? We don't talk about this vulnerability with our team members.
Yeah.
So it's made me really think about the terminology I'm using with my team, because I want them to know I've been there.
Right.
I experience imposter syndrome. This is the term for it.
Yep.
Go look it up yourself if you want more info, or I'll show you my Googling.
My history.
But yeah, it made really like struck home that I think we only confess our imposter syndrome to those of us that we see as our leadership equal.
Yeah.
And we're scared to share that with our teams that we manage, because either we're thinking they aren't going to trust us anymore. I don't know. It's really interesting. I'm curious of why that is, but it's definitely a thing.
Well, and I think like it's viewed as a weakness in very like traditional management to share any sort of weakness, because I think then maybe there's the thought that like the team will think that you're not capable, right? And like, well, who are you to lead us then? Or I think especially like in servant leadership, being vulnerable actually creates like connection with the team. And I think, when you talk about like using the term specifically, utilizing that verbiage, like the team can, your team member can be like, yeah, I literally experience imposter syndrome as well. And so it's like that connection point, as opposed to being like, yeah, sometimes I feel crazy anxiety and I panic. And, it still may not translate as easily as like, yes, we both experience imposter syndrome, a couple of years ago today. Like it helps create that connection, I think, which is so important.
Yeah. It's interesting. An interesting little thing that I hadn't thought about before, but since talking there, I've learned a lot about just in general and talking about these things of like, oh shoot, like that really does make sense, or I need to start doing this with my team because it will hopefully bridge some gaps.
Well, and because what's interesting is when you asked me, recently, who's used it with you, I'm like, well, I've not used it with my team. Right. So like, just like, I'm like, yeah, nobody's told it to me. I can be, more open and share with them, like that I am experiencing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Talking about the team. What have you learned from your team recently in regards to this?
Yeah. In regards to imposter syndrome, what I've learned is it looks differently on different team members. I think when you're like so used to experiencing imposter syndrome, you kind of like frame it in how it appears in you, if that makes sense. And so what I'm learning now is, some people might shut down, others may, maybe get kind of mean or like sarcastic or, try to deflect it. So it manifests in all different ways. And I'm learning, with my team, like, hey, maybe they're not just like shutting down right now, maybe they're experiencing something imposter syndrome. And so identifying how it looks a little bit more, I've been able to start conversations with team members to dig into it a little bit more so that we can work through it. Yeah, it's just so interesting to me how it looks so different, even between you and I,
Right.
to a certain extent, like it does manifest in different ways, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Each
Yeah.
person experiences it so differently.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
some experience it the exact same way.
True. Yeah, that's a really good point. What about you? What have you learned?
Definitely how easy it is for a team member to go down the spiral.
Oh.
Because I think it can be seen as a weakness. We don't necessarily share that these things are happening or this is how we're feeling. Recently, a team member had received a panicked email from a client.
Ooh.
And it was not anything that the team member could have predicted or knew about ahead. There was nothing that could have been done. But the verbiage that the client used in the email sent her spiraling into a like, why am I even in this profession? And
man.
like, she's amazing. And the fact that just one word really took her for a loop. And she's the one who used the imposter syndrome terminology with me the following week. So we had our one-on-one, we talked about it. And she shared that that's what she was feeling. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
We're recording an episode about that. But I mean, I know internally for me, it can be just one word or one phrase, but I hadn't really, you're so focused on yourself and that time that you're feeling it. It's like, yes, my team members feel that too.
Yep.
And it can just be one word or one phrase. So it makes me want to pay even more attention to the terms I'm using when I talk with my team so that, because I don't want to send someone down that spiral. But yeah, that was and it was interesting how it was just the one word.
Yeah.
In the email, this client, if they've written many, many emails. But it was, that one word just really sent them spiraling. And luckily, like, she was willing to share that, and we have a really good relationship. And I feel like we made progress on identifying it and how that made her feel and how she pulls herself out of it. But yeah, it was hard to see a team member go through that and share that and feel like I should have done better to prepare them for it.
Yeah.
But like, if they're anything like me, they're gonna feel it no matter what.
I know, and that's so hard.
Yeah.
It is.
But yeah, that was my what I learned from my team.
Yeah. Yep. It's I think it's so tough. It's, especially like we talk about periodically, just like with servant leadership and being so invested in our team members. Like, I know sometimes when they're like, oh, I've been stressing about this, or like I've been feeling this way, for a couple days. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I feel so bad. You like, you want to fix it from the beginning. So identifying those signs and seeing, what does send team members down that spiral is important, I think.
Yeah.
For sure. So imposter syndrome, when you think back on your career, because we've talked about imposter syndrome as maybe more, I guess more like of a topic nowadays. At least I feel like it is, more so than like early in our careers.
Right.
What would you tell yourself in the beginning of your career about imposter syndrome?
That other people experience it too.
Oh, yeah.
You aren't the only one.
Yep.
It's okay. I wish I knew that other people experienced it the same, maybe not in the same physiological or emotional way, but that it was something.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel so alone. Because now I know other people that experience it as well, and I feel a lot more comfortable being open and vulnerable about it.
Yep.
But in a traditional accounting firm, you don't show your weakness.
Oh, totally.
No. And I wasn't going to tell anyone that I was feeling these feelings, this imposter syndrome, and no one else talked about it.
Yep.
So I'm like, okay, I'm the only one apparently
Right.
that feels this.
Yep.
And that was from fairly early on in my accounting career. Yeah, I wish someone had just said like, "Hey, I'm feeling this way. Do you ever feel this way?" I'd be like, "Yes,
actually,
right now."
Thanks for asking.
Yeah. How long do you have?
Yeah, so funny you brought that up because yes.
Yeah. How about you?
Pretty similar. Like first day of work, I would write imposter syndrome on a sticky note and just leave it on my desk for me to like Google and start checking out. Because I remember starting my career, I actually thought like I had not attended some course or like something of like everyone has it figured out. I'm actually like missing some sort of like, is this an orientation that you learn how to do everything type of thing? And so I very much felt alone in the sense that like I just thought that I wasn't good enough, right? What the core of what imposter syndrome is. But to kind of like compensate for that, I guess, my first couple of years of my career, I was working out of fear, truly like protecting myself and that fear mentality because I thought I was the only one feeling this way. And I also didn't know what I was feeling. Right. And so to me, it was just, well, this is just how things are. This is who I am as an employee. And that fear, it held me back. You know, it goes back to like the growth mindset. I like, what did my career look like? I don't know. Cause I was just trying to like make it home that day, you know? So I wish I could explain to myself like what is imposter syndrome and allowed myself to learn how to process through it a little bit, in a more productive manner, I would say.
Yeah. I like that you talk about that kind of living in fear. Yeah. Because it all kind of ties back to our real goal of talking about servant leadership. Yeah. And that servant leadership is not leading through fear.
Yes. Yep.
That is the traditional way. Like you manage through fear, and servant leadership is definitely not that. Yep. And I think it's important to kind of pull back when we're looking at this imposter syndrome and say, you lived in fear for how many years? Yeah. How do we prevent that cycle from continuing with our teams so they aren't in fear for years? Because that's miserable. Yeah.
And also to that effect, you know, because servant leadership, like you also get really great results from your team members. And so, your team member isn't living in that fear, but also like you start, you know, the results in like that productive relationship so much earlier because you're not trying to overcome, that initial like fear tactic. You can truly just start with a very like supportive, trusting environment with good work, which is what we all want. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. That fear emotion can take up so much mental space and emotional space that the work you're getting out of a person who is scared for their job, scared for everything, afraid of management, isn't going to perform to their best. How could anyone?
Yeah, totally.
So, but kind of bringing it back to servant leadership there
at the very end.
Love it. Well, thanks for listening to Open Books. We hope that by bringing forward the lessons we've learned along the way during our time in the accounting industry, that others can learn from us and share in our journey as we evolve as leaders of the accounting community. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.